Alrighty. All right, we're going to get started. So as you can see from the slides, my name is Jay Balunas. I'm a senior software engineering manager at a company called Red Hat Incorporated. We're best known for the operating system Linux. And we do a lot with open source. We're basically one of the biggest open source companies in the world. In fact, 4 years ago, we were bought by IBM for $34 billion. And all of the software, nearly all of the software that we have is all open source, which means that you can go download it, you can use it, you can install it, you know, all of those things. But at the same, still people pay Red Hat for support and other things. We'll get into more of the kind of the why and how open source works in that way. But just to talk first, pretty much questions are always welcome. We can stop at any time. I'll repeat them for people online. I might not always, excuse me, I might not always have the right answer. I am a manager and I'm a little removed from the code, unlike Max, right? But I do have a lot of experience with open source and can talk about quite a bit of that. So with that in mind, after I get into the right window, my standard disclaimer, right? So one, I'm not a lawyer, right? So as far as like, there's a lot of legal aspects to open source. And so don't take everything I say as like gospel, as far as like, if you get into the nitty gritty of a legal document. Red Hat actually employs lawyers that specialize in open source licensing and like help to write some of the ones that we'll talk about today. And then, yeah, I'm not an expert on open source. I do lots of other different things, but I like talking about it. I like being part of communities and things like that. So then what I want to talk about here, you're like, well, copyright, that's not open source. So there's a copyright issue. That's kind of a core tenet of open source. So when you guys write code, when you write code for your projects, things like that, you are the authors. You own that code, right? You own its use. People can't just make a copy of it and use it for themselves, right? And you are able to apply a license to that. And that license can give others the right to use your code and things like that. At a very high level, that's what open source software is. And I kind of mentioned this because there's the whole meme thing, because there is actually a lot of debate about how legal it is to use these images over and over and over again. And the thing is with this is, if you go and make a t-shirt out of this, the copyright owner for that cartoon might sue you because you're trying to make money off of it. If you're just making memes, it's fine. Nobody will really care that much, right? So kind of with a core open source is about copyright. Let me ask, does anybody have experience with open source software? Has anyone dug into open source software, any projects, things like that? No is a perfectly reasonable answer. Okay, all right, excellent. Yeah, absolutely. Like mods and things like that, or open source video games?
You know, on the EA website, I think that there's this concept that
Okay. Okay. All right. So what was your name? All right. So Al was just mentioning that she has experience with like EA and some of their games have some open source content. Another thing very common with games are mods, and a lot of mods are open source. Like you can go to the page and be like, here's my GitHub link, and here's, you know, and it'll have a license. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. And so what this talk is hopefully going to do is give everybody kind of a good grounding in what open source software is, but also how to get involved and why would you want to get involved? What are open source projects going to expect from people that get involved, and kind of how to navigate that, right? Because it's like any other community. There's good communities, there's bad communities, there's people that want to work with you, and there's people that don't, right? It's going to happen everywhere, right? So we'll kind of jump into that. But so that might be, no, I guess you guys can probably see that. This is a fairly small room. So I wanted to kind of define open source software quickly here, right? So this is from Wikipedia. There's other definitions, but they're for the most part similar. And the most important things for me is, well, one, the computer software aspect, right? It does have to be computer software. It has to have a license. We'll talk about what that is and why it's important. You see copyright there, that's the key. The license lets the copyright owner give rights to other people. And then it has to be able to be distributed, right? Most open source projects also incorporate the second paragraph, which is a collaborate in a public manner, right? An open collaboration. In fact, most modern definitions of open source have in it non-discriminatory codes of conducts and things like that, that you can't restrict access for people using your code or being involved in your project based on gender, race, sexuality, whatever it might be. Let's see, I think that's all. So when people think of open source, sometimes people don't realize that nearly every software item that you use has open source software in it. These are some very popular open source software, right? So anyone with an Android phone, that's an open source project, right? Anyone that uses Firefox, open source project. OpenAI, ChatGPT, if you guys have seen the news about that, most of that is open source software, right? Not all, some of the language models and stuff, they're trying to figure out how to monetize it. And then like a project I've been involved with quite a bit, Node.js, which is kind of like server-side JavaScript. I was actually involved very closely with that team. So there's open source software in almost everything. Even if you go to your car and you have like Apple CarPlay, you can go down into the settings and you'll see, here's all the open source licenses that we use because they have to state that somewhere, right? So you can usually find that. So really you can't get away from open source anymore. It used to be, well, Microsoft and Apple owned everything, right? And then over time, open source really kind of won, I guess you could say. So it's more that it's just that useful, right? So like you all are going to be using React, and that's going to make making websites easier, right? Making applications easier. You wouldn't want to rewrite that. You're going to use React, right? Well, Facebook uses React, or used to. Do they still? Yeah. So, you know, I remember from the last class, right? Max has gone to React and made some updates to the React source code. So technically, yep. So technically, Max has code running on all Facebook pages or whatever Facebook pages happen to use that code. And that's where the licensing comes in, because if there wasn't all the licensing in place, Max could sue them and say, you can't use that anymore, right? So there's like, there's something. So it's not that everybody has to use open source, it's that almost everybody does, because it's that ubiquitous, right? It's just used pretty much everywhere, right? A few things, I mean, even Mac OS has open source software, right? And Macs are one of the most proprietary companies and kind of software distributions there is, right? But good question, right? For sure. All right, so at a really high level, we've kind of talked about open source software. There's these projects out there that you can join. We'll talk about how to do that in a little bit, but why would you? Why would you want to get involved with open source projects, right? So some people do it just for fun. Some people like modding communities, or they like to track airplanes, and there's an open source community that writes code for how to track airplanes or whatever it might be. So you can do it for fun and just for kind of your own enjoyment. Also, oftentimes kind of feeling a sense of community, right? I've been part of some amazing communities where I end up meeting people all over the world that like the same things I do or involved in the same stuff. And even luckily through my job, I've been able to travel to some of those places and meet some of those people, right? As far as like community events and things like that. So there's kind of that aspect. A big one, and I think it applies very, very well to this class, is you can learn new skills, right? So a great way to learn new skills, and I kind of italicized the last one, and prove that you've learned new skills, is through open source software, right? And so as you all graduate, get involved, start looking for jobs, start trying to find a career. Oftentimes employers are going to say, how do I know you passed a 6-month, you passed a 6-month coding boot camp, but how do I know you know how to program? Right. And it might be not everyone needs it, but it might be really neat to send them to your GitHub profile and say, well, these are all the things I've contributed to different projects, right? I'm actually been helping a former graduate with some open source contribution ideas and things like that, right? So there's a bunch of reasons. And the last reason is it might be part of your job, right? So Red Hat employs thousands and thousands of engineers whose job it is to work on open source projects, right? Lead the communities, just be part of the communities, be part of different foundations. We'll get into what foundations are in a little bit, right? So there's kind of a, why you would want to get involved with open source. Now, here's the thing, right? It kind of goes both ways, right? As a open source community, they'd like you to do a few things. They'd like you to use the software, right? I think last time I likened it to using or downloading an open source project like React or lots of other ones is kind of like views on YouTube, right? I can just watch a video. It vaguely helps them, right? It helps their download numbers and things like that. I can star them on GitHub, right? If it's a neat project, different items like that. So that's like kind of like at the highest level. Oh, wait, there's a question here. Mac OS is mostly proprietary, not open source, but runs open source components like the terminal run bash, which is open source. Yes.
Sorry, that was me. There was a question about Mac OS being open source.
Oh, there was? I didn't see that in the chat.
It appeared and disappeared. So
Okay, I got you. I got you. And then there's a few other aspects, right? So they'd love you to get more involved. Actually start helping people on their forums or issues, build their software on your local machines, right? There's no reason you can't download many open source software. Maybe you'll even show them with React or something like that at some point, right? Creating your own projects that use that open source. But one of the biggest ones is to really actually get involved with that project. So fixing bugs, checking the documentation and updating that, right? We'll get into some more details there, but those are great ways to get started with open source projects, right? And one thing I really care a lot about is the diverse perspectives, because oftentimes, if you've ever heard of groupthink, right, it's one of the reasons that diversity is so important in everything, is that we want lots of different ideas. And if everybody on a project is the exact same cookie cutter person, they're not going to be able to solve some of the really complicated problems out there. And that's where having a big community with a lot of involvement from all over the world really comes into play, right? So, all right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my own journey. I'll kind of zip through this. So way back in 2005, I actually made my very first contribution to a project called JBoss. I'm actually wearing the shirt right now that says JBoss on it. And I worked for a different company at the time, but I really liked it. I liked being involved. I could kind of see, and it just so happened that a company called Red Hat, the one I work for now, bought JBoss way back when, right around that time. And shortly thereafter, I started to look at jobs that were available at Red Hat. I had a couple of contributions in an open source project, had some experience, and they hired me. And I joined Red Hat all those years ago. And from there became a project lead in engineering. So I led an open source UI project called Rich Faces, which provided different types of functionality and tying into basically middleware. Java server faces is what it used to be called way back when. From there, I actually joined what's called an expert group, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So oftentimes these things will have standards. Open source software, not always open source software, usually open source software, will have these things called foundations, and foundations are basically where vendors get together and they agree on something. USB, your USB cable, that's a standard that the vendors have all agreed to follow. And they all are part of that community. That's not software in that case, right? But there is other stuff. JavaScript, for example, is a standard that different companies support, right? Same with Java and other things like that. So I was part of the foundation for this specific part of the Java server phases. However, from there, I actually created an open source project called Arrow. You can still go find it. I'm not involved with it any longer, but I did that as part of being the Red Hat mobile architect. And then at some point in that whole thing, the joke is I joined the dark side. I became a manager, right? So I now, I don't do a ton of coding directly myself, but I have a team of people all over the world that work on different projects, right? And here's some of those projects that I've been involved with at different levels. Sometimes it's helping the community. Sometimes it's working with other vendors, talking to Google or talking to whoever might be involved so that we can move the community in a good way, right? And so, yeah, so even as a manager, I can still be involved with open source, even if I'm not, right, doing PRs and making commits and things like that. So there's lots of different ways to kind of be involved. So anyway, that's my kind of my open source journey, and the one I'm still kind of on, well, not kind of, the one I'm still on at the moment. All right, so let's talk about some basics around open source. All right, so here's kind of a pretty good list of the basic parts of an open source project. The first two are the only ones that are actually required, right? So literally, if you had a website where you did nothing but upload some code on an FTP server, and that code had an open source software license in it, you are technically an open source project, right? Like you can qualify as that. There's no governance, by the way, that says you are or aren't. You can just put your code up there and it might be. Now you all have been using GitHub, right? GitHub is probably, no, it's not probably, it is the biggest repository of open source software projects, things like that, right? There's other ones like Apache, Apache Software Foundation, which if you've ever heard of the Apache web server, that's where that comes from. And all of these, all projects can be very, very different, right? Kind of like what I was saying about communities. And it's one of the things I want to drive home because it's kind of like speed dating or something like that. I don't know. I've been with my wife since 9th grade, so I don't know much about that. But the point being that you want to see how projects are, how they interact with people. And a big part of that is going to come down to these things like governance, right? How is a project led or controlled? Are they part of vendors or are they part of foundations? Is there a vendor that just leads it? For example, Android is an open source project, but it's completely dominated by Samsung and Google, right? Like they're the controlling ones. And then there's things like the community site. Lots of open source projects have community sites. And another big one is around contributing. So I'll show you what a contribution guide looks like, and also code of conduct and what the differences are between those. All right. So I've talked about this a bunch, about open source licensing and why it's important and things like that. And it really has to do with intellectual property. So that's the copyright. So intellectual property is what I own because I wrote it, plus open source principles, which is about sharing code and different things like that, equals open source licensing, right? And so this is, I can't remember this guy's name. Torvalds? No, I don't know. I'll have to look it up. He's one of the big original founders of open source software way back when, right? So back when Linux first started. And one of his big things is when we say free software, it's free as in freedom because you can use it, things like that. It's not always free as in price, right? So sometimes you still pay for it, things like that in different ways, right? Depending. So I won't just read down all of these. These are some kind of high level rules that this site, the Free Software Foundation, says must be part of an open source project, right? And for example, like no discrimination, the free distribution is kind of an obvious one, right? Things like that. You're 2 slides ahead of me. No, that's a great question. So no, there are tons of different open source licenses. And technically, if you wanted to, you could make your own open source license because I'll show you what it really is. It's just a text document that's part of your repository, and that's it, right? That's how you license something. So licensing is crucial. One, it tells us licensing is what creates a community. Without licensing, nobody knows if I contribute code, what happens to it? If I contribute code and it's broken and a car crashes, can I get sued? Right? If you think about it that way, right? So part of open source licenses is also kind of one of those disclaimers. This is all as is, right? Use at your own risk, kind of legal protections, kind of both ways, right? It also determines the business model if you're interested in open source business, right? So Red Hat sells open source software support and other aspects, right? And so it's important based on the open source license how that might work. And then it needs to be easy. If it's not easy, no. If the license is too complicated, no one's going to want to use it. What was the one I mentioned last time? It was it React and the relicensing Facebook did, right? So
WordPress wants to use it in their text editor, and the licensing is too restricted.
mm-hmm.
It was a license that said, well, we own this, we get to make whatever changes we want to it. And WordPress is like, well, we need this to be more open, we need a less restricted level.
Yep. And they went through and literally relicensed their whole software code base, which sounds both easy and hard. Can I just swap out that file? Not really, because there's some legal aspects there as well, but nothing. I don't want any of this to seem too scary, right? It's not meant to be scary. Open source site, it's supposed to be, 99% of projects you join, you're going to be very well-known licenses that I'll show you right now, in fact. So there's kind of a big spectrum of different license types. So there's some licenses like way over here on the permissive, MIT, Apache, BSD. BSD is the one that we were just talking about with React, right? It was like a BSD plus is what Facebook was using, and they changed it to just BSD, if I'm remembering correctly. So these basically say you can use it for whatever you want. You don't have to distribute your source code if you use us, and provides the protections for authors and things like that, right? An author, I can't come back and change my mind as an author. I can't contribute to code, like I kind of alluded to earlier. I can't contribute to a project and then change my mind and say, you can't use any of that anymore, I'm going to sue you. All right, so that's part of the licensing as well. And then you move kind of over here. We don't have to get too much into like the strong copy left. So, but these are what's called, oh, what is it? Virus? No, not virus. These licenses make it so that like GPL is a license where if you modify the source code, like I'm a business and I want to use something that's GPL licensed. If I use it, I have to distribute it makes my entire code base GPL, right? And so the problem there is then I have to distribute all of my software. And there are foundations that will sue companies that don't do this, right? So this is kind of like a very pure, like open source. Everything that ever uses it is going to be open source kind of thing. That's why these aren't used very often anymore, because companies and people, it makes it a little too restricted, right? So I don't want to dig too deep because it gets a little, well, I don't know all the ins and outs, but also there's a reason all the ones on the left side there are used much more often. All right, so next up is governance, right? So if licensing is a legal framework for collaboration, I really like this. I didn't come up with this. One of the people I work with came up with some of these slides. Governance is the social framework for collaboration. It's how they want you to join, how to engage, right? Different types of structures for the projects and things like that. And so that kind of leads into something called foundations. So I've kind of hinted at software foundations before. Software foundations are kind of a umbrella legal construct that open source projects can be part of. They don't have to. So most projects up on GitHub aren't going to be part of these foundations. I just want to give you an overview. So if you run into these, you at least know what it is, right? You have a kind of an idea of what these are, right? So these are things, especially for example, like Cloud Native Computing Foundation, Linux Foundation, you know, things like that. These are organizations that are set up so that vendors and people can work together on big software projects like Linux, right? A server software distribution, or Apache Web Server, or Kubernetes, if you've heard of that. And so a foundation makes it possible for multiple vendors and multiple people to be involved in the same project. And it makes it so that one company can't just control the whole thing. And so that's why sometimes, like at Red Hat, we've really pushed for certain projects to move into foundations, because it'll make it so we can contribute more, right? We want to make sure we're contributing to a community that's going to be susceptible. I don't know if that's the right word. That's going to be a safe place for people to contribute. Another vendor isn't just going to say, nope, I'm going to take my toys and go home, and you can't use it anymore, and stuff like that. All right, communities. So this is where it gets a little bit more kind of boots on the ground and things to think about for you getting involved in your own open source journeys, right? So like I said, each one is different, but most have these, right? So websites, repositories, some sort of issue tracking. Almost all of this is done on GitHub, right? That's one of the great things GitHub did. By the way, do you guys know that GitHub was bought by Microsoft several years ago for $15 billion? So it's actually Microsoft behind the scenes on GitHub, right? So, but Microsoft has changed a lot over the years, and actually pretty big supporter of open source software, right? So, but at least for now, right? You never know, right? So, but that said, I think they've actually done a really good job with GitHub keeping it separate. So, you know, you log in and you don't feel like, oh, this is all Microsoft and that type of stuff. So they also, good open source projects will also have a process for workflows and decision making, which leads right into the community roles, right? So oftentimes communities will have different roles. If it's a small community, if it's, I just uploaded a file that has a license on GitHub for a game mod, for example, all right? That's an open source project. GitHub has issues. You can post issues, right? I may never touch that code again, right? But in that case, I would be like the owner, the lead, right? There's no governance. It's just a file I uploaded. But as the projects get bigger, there's more roles, and there's usually leads and module maintainers and different kind of breakups, right? Depending. You can be both. You can be either a contributor or a committer. So have they learned PRs and kind of the PR workflows and all that?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay. So parts of that is like, if you're a contributor, I can put in PRs. So pretty much anyone can put in a PR into a project. Here's a change I suggest, right? And some information. Committers are the ones that can actually accept those and move that into the source code efficiently, right? And there's actually a lot of like supply chain security aspects that come up, because bad people could put bad code into good software projects if they have the right access. There was a really big thing that happened recently. I can't remember the details, where basically some project basically said, stop using us. Our code from this version on was basically some bad actor went in and put bad code in it to open up a back door or whatever it is, right? Yeah.
And yeah, I've had a couple of those issues where an open source package just said like, oh, I'm getting sued because someone else wanted the name of the package, and so they just deleted the package, and it was a cascading failure.
Yeah. So that was the big one there.
Like L pad or something.
Yeah, left pad. Yeah. Left pad, I think is what it is. So this is an example where, as Max was just saying, a very popular node module, and it's really small. It doesn't even do that much. Basically, the author of it got sued and he pulled it out of the repositories and like half the internet, not half, like 10% of the internet broke, right? Because none of the builds would work anymore. So all of a sudden things were breaking all over the place. I forgot how that resulted. Well, he got sued and he was pissed is kind of what I've heard.
I think from what I understand, he had a cease and desist on another one of his projects that was all something that was trademarked. And so he was kind of mad about that and deleted this left hand package. And so now NPM has all of these policies of like, you can't just delete something once you distribute it. Like,
right.
And if you have like a million active installs, you can't just be like, okay, I'm done today. So,
right. Yeah. And so, and part of like things like what happened to that repository in NPM is part of how the value statement that Red Hat gives, right? I promise I'm not a sales guy for Red Hat, but part of what Red Hat does is it takes open source projects and it curates them and says, okay, all of these we're going to support, this big company is going to support all of these open source projects here, right? Because I guarantee you Coca-Cola, FedEx, whoever, they want someone to call if it's broken, right? And that's where Red Hat comes in with our different software. All right, so now we're going to get into the code of conduct stuff, which is good. Just another funny meme, right? So just because you know Git doesn't mean you know how every project wants you to use it, right? Every project will have its own kind of setup, and the biggest thing to follow is almost all projects will have this contributor.md or another file in the base. I'll actually show you. Here's Node.js's, right? And it has things like triaging a bug report, asking for help, dependencies, what's the process for creating a new PR, for example. Can you jump? Sure. So this is a project I'm involved with right now, right? Called Keycloak. It's a security software, but this is just their GitHub page, right? And you can see there's code, issues. So the project has 1.6 thousand issues open right now, right? 230 pull requests, discussion. So this is all those things I was mentioning in the other ones. Like you have the source code, you have bug tracking, you have ways to contribute with pull requests, discussions, right? Things like that. And the Keycloak project, like this is an example of their contribution guide, right? So if you want to contribute, open a discussion, they even have bugs that are literally labeled good first issues, right? So sometimes really good open source projects will have a label on there that will say, we'll have that type of thing. Here's, for example, here's Node. So they talk about open governance model, they're part of a foundation, right? And then this is where I want to talk about code of conduct, which is the next slide, but I'll just show you here. So this is a code of conduct for Node.js. And this is kind of like how we expect people to behave, right? Don't show up and throw a tantrum because somebody disagreed with you. Oh, it's happened. I guarantee, I promise, I've seen it, right? Just if somebody disagrees with you, don't start calling them names and stuff like that, him or her, right? And so this is also about discrimination and how we expect people to treat each other, right? On different projects. So it's actually so well known, or such a big part of so many open source project or communities, that there's actually an entire website, contributor covenant, that is literally has like, here's a really good legal reviewed code of conduct that you can use, right? And a lot of projects will use this. It's kind of a well-known thing, right? It even has like translations into different languages, different versions, who adopted it, right? Things like that. Let's see, back to the slides. So the contribution guide, submitting, this will have all the details, right? The reason I'm not going to get into any of those specifics is because it might be different on every single project, but a good project will have a contributing guide. The code of conduct we just talked about. So engagement. What are some things to look for when you want to find and engage with an open source project? What ways can you engage, right? Touched on some of these earlier, but you can just consume the software, right? You can unknowingly use it as just like when you use Apple CarPlay in your car or whatever it might be. You can be a user of the software itself. So React, for example. You can be a community member, and that doesn't have to be a complex thing. You can just start answering questions on the forums. You can ask questions. Hey, I tried this, it didn't work. Anyone know what's going on? Right, that type of thing. You can be a contributor, where you're actually looking at their documentation, tests and test cases, right? These are areas where oftentimes new users on a project, it's a good way to introduce yourself, right? That you're being helpful and things like that. You don't have to. If you've got a great idea and you want to put in a giant, massive PR, you can do that as well. It's just a little tricky. It's kind of like if some stranger came up to you and your friends and said, I have a great new way for us to work together. And you're like, I don't know who you are, right? Like, so, you know, if you think about it as like a community and kind of a group, you got to introduce yourself, right? That type of thing. So there's committers, you know, expert group members, all those types of things as well. Was there another question in here? Oh, no, that's you again.
Yeah, I was sharing that way.
Ah, okay, I get it. All right, so how to pick a project. So this is one thing, like I was helping one of the former graduates of here actually, because she wanted to get involved with some open source projects. There's some things you want to keep an eye out for. One is, why are you doing it, right? Have a good reason for doing it, because what you don't want to do, well, you can, no one's going to like yell at you, right? Is if you want to get involved, show up, do one thing and never show up again, and then come back like 2 years later. Like, it's like, oh, you disappeared for 2 years. Like, you know, I mean, life happens, right? Don't get me wrong, it happens to everybody. But have a vision for why you want to be involved. Are you learning a new skill? Are you doing it for fun, right? The things we kind of talked about before. Another important aspect of picking a project to start to get involved in is the programming language and the stack that it uses, right? You all are learning about JavaScript right now. I wouldn't recommend going into like a C# project for the first time. It might be difficult for you to kind of break those down. Not impossible, like it's not a, you know, you can't do it, but it's, you know, just something to keep an eye out for. Another thing is around project maturity. So, and this is one thing that the former graduate here was running into. She was looking at a project about, there was a PDF reader or a PDF editor. And the problem is it's a really small project. It might only be like 2 or 3 people. They may not really want or care or look at it anymore, right? Like, you want to find projects that are active, right? And you can do that oftentimes, like with GitHub has their stars, right? You'll be involved with lots of different things, right? So you want to look at that maturity. You can look at things like, are people actively contributing to it? So you can go to the website, right? And this is where GitHub is awesome, I think, in my opinion, right? You can go to the website and you can see how active are the issues, right? Are issues being actively opened and closed? Are the discussions lively, right? Or is nobody involved really, right? That type of thing. These are just important things to keep in mind. To go with the meeting a group, it's kind of like if you go to the bar and there's nobody there except for like 2 old timers that don't even want to talk to you, that can be one type of open source project, right? Another one is, you know, oh, come on in, we've got, you know, everything, right? So, and that's why you want to look for things like bugs, like good first issue, right? That's usually a really good sign they want people to be involved, right? So let's see, I think we're almost done. So I know we just talked about it, but I've seen it happen over and over and over again. Please read the contribution guide, because what you don't want to do is show up and they're like, hey, we have this, and it's not even, most of them aren't even that long. we have this document, how we'd like you to engage. And you show up and you're like, don't know, you clearly haven't read that, doesn't go over too well, right? And so the same with the code of conduct, although if you're a good human being, I think the code of conduct will be pretty obvious. At the same time, it's not obvious to everybody apparently. So that's why we have them. So you can check there. You want to make good first impressions as well. And then obviously ask questions. If you ask questions and it's crickets and no one gets back to you on a question, like I'm just using, right? That's not a good sign, right? That's not a healthy community problem. And then here, start small, right? I'll use Kyle again as the example that she was the graduate from the last one. She did a great job. She debugged this thing. She found an issue with the installer and she modified the doc. She had her whole thought train and stuff. And start small. See if you get traction with it. Is it something you're interested in or fun with? Is the community engaging with you? That type of stuff. Now, I still encourage her because she did all this work already, right? But it's the type of thing where sometimes ask for kind of help from others, right? You have a good network of people within the careers in code, but also like open hack and codes and things like that. If I've seen some of you obviously there and at the common space and stuff like that, right? Yeah, kind of a tagline at the end, right? Be curious, right? I always try to tell people, come from a place of curiosity. I want to understand the code or the people or the questions or whatever it is. And then I think being kind and being respectful are kind of go hand in hand, right? So that's my presentation. Does anyone have any other questions? Any thoughts, things like that? I think I have some other ones. How am I doing on time? Oh, good. Right. So that's always a good question. So it really does come down to primarily the support model. And there are other aspects to it. There's consulting, right? So especially in the JBoss days, it was a smaller company in Red Hat, but the model still goes through. So we hire amazing software developers that are actively part of open source projects. I've personally hired people who, through the community. Hey, would you like to do this full time kind of thing? And so we hire really good people that can then either maintain that software. So a bug comes in, a support issue, whatever, we can get that fixed and out to the customers, and open source it, by the way, right? That's another, we don't keep those fixes in-house, or consulting services. So if a company says, I don't want to hire a whole bunch of people that know how to do that. I want to hire you to do that for me. We have a consulting side of the business as well. So a lot of open source product companies kind of follow that model. This day and age, cloud computing, SaaSes, software as a service, you will also run into a lot of situations where the company will have an open source project and then they'll have a hosted version of it with kind of bells and whistles around it, making it easy to use. So like Kafka. Kafka is an open source project. I can install it, manage it, tune up a VM, performance it, upgrade it, or I can go to a website and say, I would like a Kafka channel, please. And here's an endpoint, right? That type of thing. But yeah, good question for sure.
WordPress is probably the biggest example of that. WordPress will say, do your own WordPress website. You got to set up the server, you got to have hosting, you got to do all of that. Or you can just go to WordPress.com, put in your credit card and get it. And so that's a very common. WordPress is probably top 10 largest open source project.
Yep.
But also makes money by saying, well, if you don't want to go through all the work setting up a project, you can just pay us and we'll do that for you.
Yep. No, go right ahead. 100%. So the question or the comment was, have I really hired people from an open source project, just for the people online? I've done that multiple times, right? So for example, I'll give you a really great example. we had the Aero Gear project that I mentioned earlier. We started that. We were hiring for that. And I had one of my engineers was in Brazil. And one of his buddies was contributing to the Android library that we had. And I was talking to Bruno, and Bruno, like, what's going on? Like, we need to hire another person. What about Pasos? And he's like, yeah, he's not really interested. I said, can I talk to him? And he's like, I found out he wasn't really interested because he didn't have his degree. He was only 3 years in, and he didn't think he could like get a full-time job without that. Now it happens in Brazil, that happens a lot. So a lot of times in Brazil, and this isn't a universal rule, go to that first slide, right? I'm not an expert in all of this, but in Brazil, oftentimes people will go get a job after 3 years in college and not wait to the 4th year and a full degree. But yeah, I'd hire somebody out of high school if they had an open source track record and could prove what they were doing. Like, yeah, so I mean, everyone's going to be different, right? So don't take this as gospel, but he was helpful to people in the community, to other people coming in. He obviously wrote good code and very well commented. He worked very well with the rest of the team. So these are things that are really important qualities for open source development. And I'll give you, like, I've worked remote for 13 years. My entire teams over all those times have been remote. I've had a handful of people in offices. And so it's really important that we understand how they're going to interact and engage. And that model is the open source model, right? So, yeah.
Question remotely, is there a specific way or format to license open source software?
Way or format. So I never did actually show you all what a license file looks like. Where is it? I'll go to Keycloak. Oh, that's too big. Just a second. So license.txt. So this would be an example, right? So Keycloak is Apache 2.0 licensed. GitHub adds these really great, like, what does it mean? All right, what does the license mean? And you can kind of dig in. But because we use a very standard license, for example, the 2.0 came out January 2004, right? And it's a very legalese document, right? Contributions, grants of copyright, patent licensing, like what happens if you make a patent out of this? How do you redistribute, right? But at the end of the day, it's literally just a document in the repository that's called license.txt or whatever, right? And if you know, it's kind of like the nuclear arms race with some companies where, like, what was it? Oracle sued Google for using Java, right? It was a really big one a little while ago in Android, right? And it was a good multi-billion-dollar lawsuit, basically. And it had to do with licensing and if they were redistributing it. And I don't know all of the details and outs, but yeah, so that's this is how you would do, this is how you apply a license. We used to actually do it with individual files as well, but I think you can get away from that now. Like, in other words, I don't think every file will have it. I certainly hope not. Maybe it does. Nope. Yeah, good. I'm actually really happy to see that. When I first, back in my day, we would have the license text either at the very top, like a little bit of it, or like a footer at the bottom. Really good questions, though. Any other questions? There's one about, like, for example, a resume, right? Like, yeah, right. So how do you show this on your resume? Because it's not like you have a work history, right? Literally, you can oftentimes, and you can find some examples online as well. You can kind of have like a work history, and then you control the resume and look however you want. You have an open source involvement or open source engagements, and you can just list out links to your GitHub profile, different things you're proud of. I implemented this thing. I fixed the documentation and the testing framework for whatever it might be. Max fix something in React, right? You know, that type of thing. That's how you would do it. You would just have a section to show your involvement. Companies will like to see that. Even non-open source companies will like to see that, I guarantee it, because they want to see not a professionalism, it's getting late, a track record towards that. So, all right, any other questions? Any other thoughts? I'm around with OpenHack quite a bit, and we also run a monthly Codes Common Space Day down at Common Space in Syracuse, where a bunch of us get together. We were actually at TCG Player. We did a tour of TCG Player last week as part of that. So I encourage you to be part of the Codes community and kind of follow us on Meetup and stuff like that. So, all right, thanks a lot. Appreciate it. All right. Let me stop sharing. And then you guys still have class, right? Sadly. I was gonna say.
Yeah, we go until 8:30, so if you think it's late for you.
Oh, boy. All right. I don't want to like make anyone deaf or anything.
Give us 2 minutes, guys, then we will dive back in.
Best of luck with your guys' project and things like that. Don't let Max be too hard on you.
Jay is frequently at OpenHack as well, so familiar face to look for.
You should, it's fun. So it came with the LED, and yeah, a little guilty. So I like to play video games. And this is actually a pretty high-powered gaming laptop. Most gaming laptops look like an arcade, right? And so if I show up at a business meeting, like when I'm on a face-to-face, I've had people open it up and it looks like, you know, it's like the lights are all. This was like the most business-looking gaming laptop I could find. So, but I can't seem to get that light to turn on. I can make it go rainbow and like dance colors, but it's very distracting. Right, so that's the minimum for kind of the business edit. All right, you all have a good class.
All right, let's dive on in here. We are going to start by let me move this over here. Sorry, we are going to start by creating our folders based off of yesterday's code. So I am move this off screen. Let me move this off screen. Okay, first of all, any questions from Jay's presentation? Open source software, very great way to get started. A lot of people will graduate the program and say, all right, well, what do I do now, right? So the issue that I fixed that Jay was mentioning was there was a problem on the Facebook text editor, right, which I used at work. And so whenever you pasted something, you would get 2 spaces instead of 1 space. And that was a really annoying glitch. And so I went in and I fixed it and I put in a pull request. And a pull request is basically saying, hey, here's my code, please pull it into your existing project. And so someone at Facebook reviewed it and they were like, yep, this fixes the problem. I can replicate the problem. It's always important to have very effective communication. So when I submitted the request, it wasn't just here's this code. It was here's this code. Here are the steps that it takes to reproduce it. Here's the browser that it's a problem in. Here's how I fixed the problem. And here's why that problem existed in the first place, right? And I took all of that time and then I submitted the pull request, and a couple days later, I got a email that said, hey, your pull request has been merged, right? It's been put into the project. And for a couple of years, anytime someone typed a single letter anywhere on facebook.com, it would run my code to check to see if there was an extra space there. Sounds really dumb, but that is how open source software works, is that not only can you see all of the code, but you can also go in and suggest changes to it. So that is the beauty of open source, lots of different ways to get involved with open source software. But I like to tell students that we stand on the shoulders of giants, right? Open source software is so commonly used because it's so much easier to use software that someone else has already created and then add on top of it. Anyone think of the biggest open source software that we've used so far? That's a good guess, and actually might be bigger than my the thing I was thinking of. Yes, Visual Studio Code is open source software owned by Microsoft, but Microsoft is the one that kind of supports that and has that out there. Bootstrap was the other one that I was thinking of. Bootstrap, all open source software. You can see exactly every line of code that it takes to make Bootstrap work. And if you're looking at that and you're like, I think the button is dumb and I don't think it should be rounded, right? You could theoretically submit a pull request. This is a stupid example, but you could submit a pull request and be like, button shouldn't be round on Bootstrap anymore. Well, that would be a bad way to contribute to an open source project, because the leaders of that project are like, well, we can't just make a change to Bootstrap and have everyone's buttons and everyone expected to be rounded suddenly not round. But hypothetically, you could start a discussion and say, here's a list of 20 different reasons buttons shouldn't be round by default. And someone on the Bootstrap community could discuss with you and go back and forth. And they may say, you know what, you're right. And in the next version of Bootstrap that we release, we're going to take your pull request and merge it in, and buttons won't be round anymore. Dumb example, but that is how Bootstrap, that is how open source software works. Latonia.
That the way you recorded everything, but that debug was good, and is that something that even promotion?
It was not behind the scenes. Most of everything you do on open source is public. So you could find it. The other one that I run into all the time is I use a open source package called React Select, right? And that is, you know how when you go on, like, you're checking out and it says state, and you pick on the state drop down and it won't let you type N, and you have to like literally scroll all the way down to New York. React Select is a really, really great popular package that allows you to type in like NEW and have it filtered down to New York. It allows you to do like multi-select drop downs, all kinds of stuff that you kind of wish was built into the native select. Well, I have a problem. There's a problem with that package where I would use that package in a modal. Modal's like a little in-page pop-up kind of. And for whatever reason, whenever I use that select in the modal, when you open the drop-down list, the drop-down list would get cut off at the bottom of the modal. It wouldn't like expand down to the bottom of the screen. Seems like a really silly thing, but I opened a GitHub issue on that, which isn't quite a pull request, but it's saying, hey, I'm having this problem. Can someone help me out with it? And it's project specific. And I went back and forth with the developer of that package. And eventually we came up with a solution of, well, if you put this CSS on the modal, it will prevent this issue from happening. Well, because I was so thorough, you want to be careful when you're posting to open source, right? You're essentially asking someone for help or asking someone to do a favor for you. And so communication is very important. For anything that important, I always say, write it, minimize it, come back to it a couple hours later and reread it and see if there are any typos, see if what you're posting makes sense. You may have been working on this issue for 8 hours, but the developer doesn't know that. And so you want to be careful when you create an issue like that. But because I was so thorough in creating that issue, now every time that I go to use that React Select package, I'm like, damn it, my modal isn't working. And I go through and I'm like, oh, this issue solved the exact problem that I was hoping to solve. I wonder who wrote this. And then I'm like, I wrote that. That is why. Let me see if I can. So I can't remember if it's in the modal package or in the select. So this package has 26,000 stars. Just to give you context of what that means, if we look at the number of times this package has been downloaded, NPM will tell us that this is downloaded 5 million times this week alone. Kind of nuts to think about. But inside of this, if I go to the issues and do a look, a search for something like modal, okay, there are a lot more modals than I was anticipating. Okay, this is make React. Oh, yeah. Aha. React Select being compatible with React Modal, right? And so this is a closed issue, and you can see how I opened up that issue, right? So it wasn't just, this doesn't work in React Modal, it was, this is the problem that I'm having, this is, that's the reason why I opened it on the React Modal side. And so I said, this is the code that it takes to reproduce it. React Select is a hugely popular open source package. So is React Modal. You know, this is what I expect to happen. And these are literally screenshots from our software. And this is what happens. It gets cut off. So you can't see these, like the options at the top of it. And someone replied to me with the problem. And I said, wow, that fixed it. And I marked that as the closed issue, right? And so now whenever I'm using both of these packages again, I go, oh, there's an issue where it's not working with React Modal, and I can go reference this and see exactly what the all the way back. And a lot of React Modal is a package that has been downloaded 1.7 million times with so two very popular packages. Oftentimes when you will open an issue, they will often give you a template. For the love of God, please do not delete this and just put in whatever you think you should put in. There is a reason why they have this broken out this way. It's because there are 434 closed issues and 154 open issues with this package alone, right? And so what they have found in all 600 issues that have been reported about this software, that the things that are most important to them to know how to how to solve a problem are a summary, the steps to introduce, the expected behavior, a link to where that issue is in your own code, and then any additional notes that you would like to provide. So every project will have its own issue template. So every project will be a little different, but this is a very popular. Hey, I've got a problem, and instead of leaving a bitching about it, this is what the format, the model. Okay. Any other questions about today's presentation? All right, step back and take my time. I am headed to my code. I am headed to my weekend. I am duplicating my day 1 and renaming it to my day 2. I am dropping back in VS Code. I am starting there. Does that fix the audio issue?
Oh my God, that's 1,000% better. I don't know
Lesson learned, I cannot charge the wireless mic receiver. Sorry. Please call me out on that if that's an issue ever in the future. Okay. I am pasting my live share in Zoom, so you can grab it from there. I am doing my go live. I am popping open my index and my script. And throwing that down there. Okay, so where did we leave off last night? We were talking about this array and an array, right? And we were basically saying that, hey, keeping track of the X's and where the user has played is helpful, but it would be even easier if we kept track of it in our JavaScript. So we can use this is called a multi-dimensional array. Well, that sounds scary, but what does it mean by multi-dimensional? It runs across, but then it also runs down. So oftentimes the most common use of a multi-dimensional array is to keep track of things like X, Y coordinates. The only difference is that instead of like traditional math where the X is down, the 0, 0 point is in the bottom left, the 0, 0 is in the top left, right? And so 0, 0 is going to give me this spot, 0, 1 is going to give me this spot, 0, 2 is going to give me this spot. 1, 0 is going to give me this spot, 1, 1 is going to give me this spot, 1, 2 is going to give me this spot. And we use those by using our bracket syntax there, right? We're able to just chain 2 of those indexes together, and that gives us what we need. Okay. Any questions about any of that? All right, so what we need to do is we need to generate out our HTML over here so that our data reflects what's in our board. Now, of course, when the game starts, we want this board to be empty, right? But just so we have something to test with to make sure that that is working, we're going to leave some data in there to see if we can get our X's and O's to show up the right way. So because it's an array, the first inkling we should have is we need a loop to go over each one of those things. So what I'm going to say is I need to get each row of the board. That is going to give me access to this individual array as we're looping down. Then I need to also loop over each individual spot in that board. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the col of the row. Okay, how does that filter down? The board comes down to this board here. Every time we run this loop, row is going to become one of these arrays. And then each time we go through the row, we want to go through each col of that row. So we are going through and getting each individual spot here. To make sure that's working, I'm going to console log out our col. And this is really important to say, do I understand what this output is telling us? It is saying O is the first thing that it sees because it is right here. Then it is moving on and there's a blank spot. So we see nothing in that spot in the console. Then we see that X is here. Now this inner for loop is done running. So we go back up to our outer for loop and the row is going to become this array right here. So we go, all right, we need to go rerun that for loop. So we get the row back in here. The row is now this big array up here, and we want to loop through each spot, each column in that row. So we see the first O that comes out is our O here, the X, and then our blank spot. Make sense? Okay, so now we've got our loops made. Now we've got to make some HTML for that. Well, we've already done most of that work. We've got our div ID board up here. What we basically need it to do is generate out the buttons for us. So what we're going to do is we're going to say let generated HTML equal an empty string. We need some place to put all of that HTML before we can start shoving it in somewhere. Now, what do we want to happen for each row? Well, each row gets its own div. We can see that here, and it gets its own closing div as well. So we need to be very careful about where we're putting that. We're going to say generated HTML plus equals a div. Plus equals is going to say add on to the end of what HTML has already been generated a new div. That's going to line up with our div up here. We also need to come down here and say, hey, once you are done generating out all of the columns, go add on our closing div. Oh, thank you. The mistake I had, that should be HTML in all caps because I had it in all caps when I declared that variable. Okay, now what do we want to be generated for each column? We know it's going to be for each column because it's inside the block of code that my for loop has, right? So I'm going to say generated HTML, add on, and I'm going to use the template literal there, my backticks. Why do I want the template literal? Because when I generate a button, I want it to include whatever the value is in that column. So I go ahead and save that, and nothing has changed over here. Well, we did all of this work in our JavaScript. Now we got to bust that JavaScript out of the JavaScript into the HTML. So we're going to say document, get element by ID, board. Where's my board coming from? That is the div ID that I already have up here. And I'm going to get the inner HTML of that and shove in the generated HTML. And save. And now I almost have everything that I want, but I've got these weird squished buttons in there. That is because we used our NBSP up here. So you might be tempted to put your NBSP into the board here, but that just seems a little hacky, right? We don't really want to keep track of what things are empty by if there's a non-breaking space in it. So what we're able to do is we can use a ternary operator, or we can use a shortcut for a ternary operator. So instead of saying just col, I'm going to say if the col value exists, use that. Or put in a NBSP if that col value does not exist. So this is our OR operator. And if you kind of look at the code, that kind of makes sense, right? Either put in the value of the call or put in a non-breaking space if that value does not exist. I'm going to pause there, give you guys a minute to catch up on that code. Final output, we should be able to see over here that our board is represented by what we're trying to do. Anyone needs help on that? Feel free to raise your hand. If anyone does not understand a line of code they just wrote, raise your hand. Or put a question in chat, or send a question to Latonia in chat, and Latonia can ask the question for you. Yep. So start from the top. We have our data hanging out in our JavaScript. This is a multi-dimensional array because there is an array inside of the array. If you think about multiple dimensions, you think about X, Y on like a graph, right? There's height and there's width to something. Same thing for our board. There is a 0 coordinate, which is basically saying which row are we in. And then, I'm sorry, there's an X coordinate and there's a Y coordinate, right? For how far over are we going? So what we are doing is we're trying to get this board to show up over in our HTML. But this is just an array. We need to take this array's worth of data and generate some HTML that's going to show up in our interface. So what do? We create a placeholder that we can put all of that HTML in. Then we need to loop over each piece of the data here. Why are we using a loop? Because hypothetically, don't follow me on this, just an example, we could create another row. And because we wrote our loop, that is automatically going to just show up. We don't have to add anything in the HTML that's getting generated because we are looping over all of that data. Okay, so how do we loop over it? Well, we have to tell it what we're looping over. We're looping over the entire board. That gives us access to this array to start. So this whole array is what shows up in the row. Then whatever we do in here is going to be done for each row. And we can see that because if I console log out the row, I'm going to see first the first row, then the second row, then the third row. Good so far? Okay. So now I'm like, all right, that's great. I have access to that row, but I don't really care about the whole row. I care about what each value is inside of that row. But before I can even loop over that, what's supposed to show up for each row? A div shows up. This div here is lining up with this div in here. We also have a closing div. So we say right before we move on to the next row, throw another div in there. Okay, great. Now what do we do for each value, each column inside of the row that we're looping over? We want you to generate out this button tag. And that button tag is either going to put in the value of what's in that column, the 0 or the X, right? The O or the X here, or put in that non-breaking space character, because we want there to be something in the button so the dimensions end up looking right. So either use the value in the column or put in that empty space. Then once we generate out all the buttons and all the divs for each row, what we are going to do is take that generated HTML and shove it inside the element with the ID of board. What that means is we can actually go in, and you can follow me on this one, go into your HTML and delete out everything that is inside our div ID board. And you'll notice that it still stays over here. Why does it stay over here? Because all of the code that we've got going on down here is checking and generating that HTML. So if I look in here and go into my inspect, you can actually see the HTML that got generated out based off of the for loops that are running here. What? You have your backticks instead of quotes. Share your screen. Let's take a look. You might be missing like a curly brace or something. You are, so a couple things. Let me request remote. You are missing your plus here. What? Am I crazy? Is it? No. Here's the problem. It's not with your plus equals, it's that you've got another let here. So if we take that out, now it's like, oh, you want me to put that inside the generated HTML that you've already declared. You also are missing your closing curly or your opening and closing curlies. That will technically work. So in a for loop, you can leave these curly braces out if the condition that you want to run is only one line of code. However, that's considered bad practice, because what if you're like, oh, I want to also do this line of code? Now you have to go back in and add in the curlies. So, and then the last thing you're missing is after we've generated out the buttons for this row, we want to add in our closing div. And if you want to test that, that should hopefully work now. Nope. One more thing. You are missing your commas between your board arrays up here. And these should not be in parentheses.
So I was and when I hit
There we go. Good. No problem. Natasha, I think it's important to recognize, Natasha said, previously declared variables are tricky for me to remember how to dig them out in a for loop. Definitely practicing the crap out of that concept. Yeah, it's important to say, like, what am I looping over, right? So in the board, we're looping over each one of the arrays inside the board. Then in this, it's called the nested for loop, we're taking that thing that we're looping over and looping over it again to get access to each individual letter or each individual value in that array. So nested for loops are definitely tricky, but basically breaking that down, and sometimes the visual helps of the board is coming down and going into that board. Okay, so what does the row mean? It means the first time that row is going to be this array down here. The second time that loop runs, it's going to be this whole row down here. Third time that it runs, it's going to be the row in there. Okay, great. Now that we're looping over each row, what do we want to do for each row? We want to add this div, but then we take that same row right here and we loop over it to get each individual column. So how does that work? The first time the column runs, it's going to come down in here. The next time the column runs, it's going to come down in here. Last time the column runs, it's going to come down and be in there. okay, what do we want to show up for each time the column runs? We want there to be a button, and then we take whatever value is coming from our arrays up here, and we dump that into our template literal right here. Or if there's nothing in that value spot, it uses the non-breaking space character. All right, we good? All right, so now let's figure out what we've broken. I'm going to go up to my board and clear out any spots that I have in there. And this is kind of cool because I can just update my data and look at what happens over on the page. It automatically updates everything. So I click on one of these buttons and it puts in the X, and then the computer plays its turn, right? And so I'm like, okay, great. That means that if I come down here and we do our button on click, I should be able to console log out the board and see where I've played. So I save, I come over, I click on a spot, and it looks like it's working. And I come down here to this console, and I open up my array of arrays, and it's empty. And I'm like, well, that's not great. Why is it working over here, but it's not updating my board up here? Well, because our onClick is doing the work of putting in that X for us, but it's not actually keeping track of that play information in the board. So how do I do that? Well, I need to know what button is getting clicked on in order to be able to keep track of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here and I'm going to say, let I can keep track of those coordinates based off of our loop, because our loop knows what order that's going to run in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say object.entries, and that is going to give us access to the row index in addition to the row itself. I'm also going to do that for this object.entries row. That is going to give me access to the col index in addition to the col. And I'm going to store that in my data row index equals my row index. And I'm going to store my data col index in my col index. Don't forget your quotes. Be careful on the syntax. Very easy to lose quotes or your equals here. So make sure that you've got quotes around that. And we are going to take a break in 1 second. The reason why that's important is if we come over here and we look in our inspect, we can actually see data row index 000, col index 012. What that is keeping track for us is what row and what column is that button actually in. So we're able to extract that row index out and our col index out by using this object.entries. And once we get access to both of those pieces of information, we are able to include that in our button. So when that button is clicked on, we're able to know which button it is. We are going to take a break here, be back at 7:25, and we will finish up our project. Yes. Well, if it's too hard for you to see, let me know and I can close them again. No. Mhm. All right, welcome back. Give everyone a minute to settle back in, get their videos back on. Remember where we were at in this code? What we were trying to do was make it so in our HTML, we could actually see what row and column that button was in. So if we take a look in our inspector in the browser, we can actually see the numbers showing up. How are they getting in there? Because of our template literal pulling the information from our for loop, which knows what iteration it's on because of the object.entries. Okay, so we've got all of our buttons generated out. We're going to go back down to our button on click. And what we need to get out is what button was clicked on. So I'm going to say const row index equal, and I need the details of that on click event. So what I need to do is add in my event as the parameter here so I can use those details. I can say event.target.get attribute, I think. And I'm going to say data row index. And all I'm going to do is console log out my row index to see if that's working. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to click on, I don't know, something in the second row, and I get 1 out. Well, that's good because it's 0 indexed, right? So if I click on 1 down here, I get 2 out. Okay, that's helpful. That's working. So let's repeat that to get out our col index. Get the attribute, the data col index out. So now I click here. Oh, forgot a console log. I can log out my row and my col. And if I save that and click, I get my 0, 0. And if I click down here, I get my 2, 2. Okay, now that I've got all of that data, I can now say, hey, go back up to my board and set the row index and the column index based off of whatever button got clicked on from the event equal to my X. And then I can modify my code a little bit down here. This is now going to be the third refactor of what we did before. Before, we started out by saying, just pick a random spot to play, right? How do you get a random spot? Just keep on looking at the board to see if you can find an empty one. Then we modified it a little bit more and we refactored it to say, okay, go through all of the buttons and go find an empty button. And once you know what all of the empty buttons are, pick a random one from there. Well, we can revise that a little bit more. We don't need to do all of this work to check to see. We don't need to go back to the document object model to do all of those buttons. What we can do is just use that board array to find where the empty spots are. So what we're going to do is we are going to comment out everything down here. So I am commenting out everything after my if statement all the way down to the end of the function. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, let empty coordinates equal an array. Now, go through each one of the rows and go through each one of the cols. And if the col is empty, then go to my empty coordinates and push in my row and my col. Yes. So if this is working, I can console log out my empty coordinates. So I save that, I come over here, I pick one spot, and what do I get out? I get too many console logs. That is on 38. So I'm going to go down, disable my 62, and now let's try that again. Now it shows me 8 empty spots. All right, let's go through that, what we're doing here. So we said, okay, we are generating out our HTML. We are trying to attach everything to this JavaScript array of items. What we do is we, oh, question?
Yes, I have my hand raised. I don't know what's going on with my code. Can I share my screen?
Yeah, go for it.
So I'm gonna bring.
Okay, so this is usually a problem around our quotes when we generate the HTML. So let's go take a look at where we did all of that data index work, which is down in here. And all of this information should be inside the button tag.
Okay.
So we got our closing, we got all of that, we got that. Okay, so now if we save this, we are back in business.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, there was the button tag was closing itself before we had put the information inside of it. Okay, so we generate out our buttons. We put the row index and the column index in there so we know what buttons are getting clicked on. Then we come down here and we say, okay, when that button is clicked on, go get the row index and the column index back out from the attribute that we put on it from right up here. Once we get that attribute out, go use that row index and the column index and put an X in that spot. Now we need to figure out where the empty spots are. So we go back through all of the rows and all of the columns again, and we check to see if that column is empty. And if it is empty, go mark that as an empty spot in our empty coordinates array. Okay, now we need to go pick a random empty coordinate. So we're going to say random coordinate, random empty coordinate would be a better variable name, equals, and we can borrow this exact line. We can say empty coordinates, go floor a random based off of the length of the array. And to check to see if that's working, we're going to console log out the random empty coordinate. So I come over here, I click on a button, and it picks out for me some weird thing that I was not expecting. Oh, sorry. Up here, it should not be row and col. It should be row index and col index. My bad. We're trying to keep track of the coordinates of that empty spot, not necessarily the whole array of the item. So let me try that again. I pick an item, and now it picked 2, 1 as an empty spot to play. I pick another one, pick 2, 0 as the empty spot to play. So I'm going to say, all right, go to the board and use the random empty coordinate 0. Why 0? Because we're trying to get this row out from it. And go to the random empty coordinate and get 1 out from it. Why 1? Because we're trying to get to that col index that we generated there. And in that spot, put an O. And finally, console log out the board. So I save, I put my X here, and all of a sudden we've broken our buttons. I'm like, we've gone horribly wrong. But if I open it, my array is keeping track of the information. And I'm like, all right, we did all of that work to do the exact same thing, and now our code doesn't even work. It's not even updating this. But wait, we've already leveraged using the board data to get our HTML to update. We did all of that work in this generated HTML document get element by ID. What if we could reuse all of that work? That's exactly what we're going to do. And then we're going to take a break, and anyone who needs to catch up can. I'm going to say const generate board equals this new function. And that function is going to do everything down to the inner HTML update the board. We want this to run when the page first loads. So we're going to call generate board right after we defined it. When else do we want to use this function here? We also want to use this function after we do all of the work to set the random coordinate. Now I come over and I click and I get my X and my O. And I can click another spot and it breaks. Okay, we're going to pause there. I'm pretty sure I know what the problem is, but I'm going to give everyone a minute to catch up. So what did we do? We had all of this HTML up here. We moved this into a function called generate board. Then, why did we do that? Because all of this code we wanted to run in one other place. We want to call generate board so it runs the first time the page loads, but then we're also able to generate out the board after we do the work of not only placing the X in the right spot, but also placing that O based off of the random coordinate. How did we find the random coordinate? We first had to go through the board and find any empty spot. And then we were able to grab a random empty spot. And because of that, we were able to set in the O based off of where we wanted it to play. Then, after we updated the data in the board, we said that data is only in the JavaScript. Go rerun the generate board. What does generate board do? It comes back up here, loops over all of that data again, and puts our buttons in using the right value that we just updated. Yeah. Yes. So this right here is lining up with this right here. After we find those empty coordinates, we need both the row value and the column value. So in order to keep track of both of them, we push that into an array, and then we're able to extract it out of the array down here. All right, I know at least one of you are lost. Talk to me about where I lost you. Absolutely. The coordinates here? Okay, so the problem that we ran into is that we clicked on a button. And when we clicked on that button, we were like, okay, what button did you click on? We don't really know that. There's no way to know that. So we kind of game the system a little bit. We say when we're generating the buttons out up here, when you make the button, don't just make the button, don't just put the 0 or the X in it. Also put in these two things called col index and row index. How do we know what the row index and the col index are? They're coming out from our loop. Our loop knows how many times it's run over it, right? And so we kind of put that in so that when we look at our HTML, we are able to see the row index and the col index. We put that in there not because the onClick doesn't work without it, but because when that onClick actually happens, we're able to reference that same row and col to get out which one got clicked on. Now that we know which one got clicked on, we're able to put the X in the right spot using that row and the col. But our fun with coordinates is not over. Now that we have made our play, we also have to have the computer make their play. Well, we can't just say pick a random spot. We learned that lesson. We have to say pick an available empty spot. Well, now I need to know what spots are empty. So I need to go through my entire board all over again and check to see if the spot is empty. And if it is, take that index of the row and the col, essentially take those coordinates and put them in this array called empty coordinates. Now, pick a random one, which is this stupidly complicated floor, random, all of that. What is all that doing? It's just picking a random one from our list of whatever's in there, and then put an O in that spot. Once we put an O in that spot, our board is now updated in our JavaScript, but we've got to tell it to go update it again in our HTML. In order to do that, we call generate board, which is just going back up and rerunning all of this code that we ran initially when the page first loaded. Did that help? Okay.
That was a lot.
That's the terrifying moment where I go, oh my God, did I hit record after the break? I did. And it is good to be like, all right, that kind of made more sense when he started talking at 7:40 p.m. So I'm going to like write down 7:40. And then when I'm rewatching the video, I don't need to go through 2 hours of pain. I can just jump right to that spot. And it's a tiny little timestamp in the bottom right if you haven't noticed. And I think it's in military time, but you can do the conversion and get to the right spot a little easier. All right. We got one bug to fix, and then we are going to do our final feature, which is, hey, the computer needs to tell us if someone won or not. For extra credit, we are going to add in the ability for the computer to intelligently block the person. But let's get our bug fixed and let's get our winning algorithm written, and then we will call it a night. So the problem that we have is, think about this the way the computer is running it. It's like, all right, go generate out my empty board. Great. Generate the board for the HTML. All right, I loop through that. I make all the HTML. Great. Then I go through and I get all of the buttons that are in the page. And then I go through and attach this onClick event for all of the buttons. Okay, now the person has clicked on a button. So I go do all of this work. I generate out the HTML again. It comes up here and it goes, screw all of your buttons. I'm making them all over again. And it makes all 9 buttons again. And it's like, I'm done. But the problem is, what about our little on click down here? Well, now this code gets really, really nasty because we'd have to attach the on click to all of the new buttons that we just regenerated again. Like, I don't really want to do that. So what we can do is we can come up to our button and we can add the on click there that's going to run our button clicked. And now this line of code is so messy that we are going to break it up so that everything is on its own line. And now that code is suddenly a lot less scary because we've added in a couple line breaks. Because we have attached our button clicked, we are now able to go down and delete out all of this code down here. And we can rename our button clicked to a const button clicked and take out our final curly down at the end of the file. Now we can click multiple times. So what was that bug? That bug was that because we were regenerating out our buttons, the on-click that we had initially added to all of the buttons at the beginning of the file was no longer on there. So what we did is we put our on-click through that HTML generation, then renamed our button.onClick to button clicked, so this function could run multiple times. And take a break. If your code is working, you are somehow gifted beyond all means because we've changed about 4,000 lines of code tonight. That is okay. I'm not asking you guys to turn this in at the end of class tonight. If your code is not working, it's okay. And if you were really bothered by that, you can schedule a one-on-one and I can help you through it. But I want you guys to take a minute to go through this existing code. Can you describe what is happening in this code? And if your answer is hell no, you didn't try. Go back through, actually read this code, see if you could describe in a sentence what that line of code is trying to say. I'm going to take like a 3-minute mini break there to let everyone catch up, and then we will dive into the last feature, which is alerting the player if someone has won. Yeah, this should actually be moved up. And then the set interval, you have to set a timeout, yeah. You kind of have to do it here. So we move this into the set timeout, because this is where it's actually getting set to the O. And so that's what we want to delay. And we can say 500 is the length of the interval. And then after we update that, we also have to generate the board again. We have to generate the board twice, once to show the X and once to show the O. And then I think we also did a your turn down here. After it places the O, it's then your turn. And then up here, this is where we say computer is thinking. Button is not defined on 27. I broke something. 27. Oh, event target inner HTML. There you go.
You ever had a time when you actually did not code something?
Oh yeah. Latonia asks, has there ever been a time that I haven't coded something? There, you can get coder's block just like you can get writer's block. Or you're just sitting there and you're like, oh, I don't even know how to start with this. I try to have an activity every morning that is going to like get the engineering juices flowing. My one this morning was that it was bothering me that when the videos got uploaded, they didn't get put in the Google spreadsheet. And it was just the date. It didn't say like week 10, day 2 or whatever. And so I extended MaxSpot to automatically pull in the information from that spreadsheet and dump it in. And because I had done that and read some documentation, I was ready to tackle the rest of the projects for the day.
So you tend to make a list when you have a project, like not necessarily requirements list, but you tend to list out the steps, or do you just kind of?
I start every day with doing a self stand-up. So I go, all right, what did I accomplish yesterday? I got stuff done. It's important to remember what I got done and kind of revel in that accomplishment. And then, okay, what am I doing today? And is my today list short enough? Is it prioritized? And so sometimes there are only 2 things on there and it's a very big feature. And sometimes there are 10 things on there and it's a bunch of little things that I can get done. Okay. How are we feeling? Does anyone have code that they are ready to throw out the window and would like me to review? Yeah, I saw. Lots of refactoring. Refactoring can be frustrating, especially when you're trying to grasp understanding, but it is a very important part of writing code. And that's why we spend time doing it in class. It's easy to get lost, but what's more important is, can I go through and understand what this code is doing? Let's test that now. We're going to go up. Oops. This is my level of understanding. Sorry, I just knocked the projector cord out and everything disappeared in person. Okay. We start at the top. We say, number 1, generate out a multi-dimensional array to store our empty board. Then we come down here and we say, number 2, make a function so we can reuse it later to generate the HTML based off the board array from number 1. Number 3, make an empty string to store the HTML in as we go. Number 4, loop over each row in our board and use entries to get the index number of the row. Number 5, for each row, add in a div tag, so they don't all show up next to each other. Number 6, loop over each column in the array, so we get access to whether there is an X, O, or empty column. Pause. Do we have any questions so far? I will go back through like wet. No, that looked wrong. Wet.
Line 10 is just empty.
Thank you. Okay, now we got into what looks crazy but isn't. Number 7, make a button that stores the index of its position into the attributes of the button. 7B, also include the value of the column, X or O, inside the tag, or put an empty space. If we make it down to this is the end of our call loop, which means that number 8 is add in closing div tag for each row. This means we are end of our row loop, which means we can, number 9, take all the HTML we generated, all the divs and buttons, and make it show up. Okay. Once we have done that, we also say number 10, generate the board the first time the page loads. Then we stop and say, all right, number 11 only happens once a button is pressed. Number 12, if the button clicked is not empty, call them a Donald Trump. I mean, a cheater, excuse me. My bad. Not like he was indicted for a second time today or anything. Okay. NBSP, check for that. Alert cheater. This return is saying stop the function and don't run anything underneath it. If they are not a cheater, then go back to index from step 7A. So we know what button they are clicking on. Use coordinates from 13 to put an X in our JS board array. Set status in HTML, and then 16, update HTML to reflect the X that got placed in 14. Anytime that we're updating our board and we want to show it to the user, we have to regenerate out the board. Now, 17, make empty list to store our coordinates. Number 18, loop over all the rows and cols again. 19. Check to see if this col is empty. 20. If it is, push this row and col into our array from 17. Pick a random empty coordinate from number 20. From number 19, I can count. Okay, then number 21, wait half a second so the computer looks like it's thinking. 22, use the random coordinate from number 20 to place an O for the computer's move. 23, update status to tell user it's their turn. And finally, 24, update board because we updated data in number 22. All of this down here, all code that we've refactored. That is normally code that we would delete once we are done our refactor. But for the sake of referencing that, I'm going to leave all of that down there. All right, now that we see all 24 steps happening, where are we lost? Where are we like, still don't understand number something? We removed the all buttons, Tara, because what was happening was we were making our board for the first time. Then we were getting all of the buttons and attaching the on click. All of that was fine. The problem is after we placed the X right here, it went through and it regenerated the board. So all of those on clicks now were not attached to the buttons because we remade all of the buttons right here. So that on click was attached the first time all of the buttons were generated, but it wasn't attached every time we regenerated the board and remade those buttons. So instead of attaching the on click after the first time the buttons are made, we instead moved our on click into what gets generated with the buttons every single time. Because we added the on click here, we no longer needed the all buttons on click down here. We were able to just link it to the button clicked through the on click that got added here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I just gotta go through and fix it.
Are there any numbers of our documentation, of our inline comments that are not making sense? Or is there anywhere that I did not put a comment that you want to comment? Or are you still completely lost and need help? Now you guys keep saying practice, practice, practice. Here's your practice. If you're panicking about this, go back and compare it to movie seats. Go back and compare it to blog. We're going to start to see this is nothing new. Yeah, the multi-dimensional array is a little different. Everything else we've done here, we've done in movie seats. We've done in blog. We've done it in the calculator. This is generating HTML. This is events. This is working with our data structures. This is if statements. This is for loops. All of those concepts we've now seen in almost every project that we've done. Now's the time to say, I'm at the end of this module. What of these concepts am I still struggling on? That's where I need to go to Free Code Camp. I need to go to Code Academy. I need to go back to the cheat sheets. I need to reference whatever. That's what we need to be saying at this point, because all of these concepts are going to appear in your capstone. So battle off that feeling of lost and go, all right, if I'm lost, let me figure out where I'm lost, because then I can figure out how to get found again. Yes, let's break that down. So the question is math.floor. Why that? Let's break down each step of what that is doing, because we're doing 1, 2, 3, 4 things here, and that's really confusing. So let's figure out what's happening there. We're going to do a console log empty coordinates dot length. What is that doing? That is saying, hey, how many empty spots are there? Right now there are 8. And if I pick another one, it goes down to 6, because every time there's a play, the computer plays, we deduct 2. Okay, what does math.random do? It makes a random number between 0 and 1. So if we're trying to get a random number between 0 and however many random spots there are, we multiply it by the number of available numbers that it could be. So we're basically saying take 6 and multiply it by whatever random decimal you came up with. Well, the problem is, if we do that, you're going to notice that our random number is 6 point something something something. And then if we pick another random one, it's 3 point something something something. Well, 3 and 6 are always under the number of available empty coordinates. So if we do another one, you're going to notice it's between 0 and 3, because that's how many empty spots there are. We're using multiplication here as a little trick to say, take the number of available spots and multiply that out by whatever random number you came up with. The problem is there is no index 3.4340. We just want that to become 3. And there is no index 6.733, but there is index 6. So the floor is basically saying chop off the decimal. And now all of a sudden you get 1, because it's not 1.7 blah, 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 blah. And if we pick another one, well, that's a bad example, we get 3, right? Why 3? Because there are 3 available empty spots, and that's where it picked to go. So if you break down the piece by piece of it, the math.floor makes sense. We're basically saying, here are the number of available spots, go randomize that, chop off the decimal, and that's the random one that we're going to pick. Correct. If you wanted to round it, you could use math.round. In this case, we don't want to round it because it could hypothetically round up and pick a number that is now out of bounds. So that's why we floor it, which is just chopping off the decimal. Max, why doesn't JavaScript have a pick random item built into an array? An array has all these functions like push and pop and unshift. Why can't I just do .random? Great fucking question. Every other programming language I've ever used has a array.random, and it just picks a random item and everything works great. Just not built into JavaScript. Super freaking annoying that we have to do a .floor on a random with length. I've got no good answer for you there. I've actually seen some people that have built a random function in, and every time, kind of like when you start a new project, you're like, oh, let me pull Bootstrap in. There are people who make their own like JavaScript library, and there are ways of making .random work on every array. So there are some people who will put in like their own basically library of functions. The other really annoying one is that math.random is great, but you can't call like random number between and give it 2 numbers and have it generate that out. So that's a very common one that people just redo over and over again. All right, if you're up until this point, we're going to officially end class now. If you are interested in seeing how I write a game checker to check to see if someone has won, you can stick around. If you feel like you have hit saturation point and you are done for the evening, do not push yourself. Go back to YouTube on this later if you are curious. Head out now if you feel like I've gotten enough out of this project. There's nothing more that can sink in. GTFO, I will see you all tomorrow. Do not forget tomorrow, your homework is to stump the teacher. So you're going to bring in ideas. It's going to be like an open office hours. You're going to be like, I've got this idea. How would you build this in HTML and JavaScript? And I'm obviously cannot do, you know, a 3-hour thing for that, but it's going to give everyone a fair chance to say, here's this thing. I'm struggling with arrays. I don't know how for loops are working. Can you build an example of using a for loop with zoo animals? Sure, I can do that, right? You can say, okay, this is this concept that I have. How would you go about approaching that? We're going to do that all day tomorrow. With that said, you are welcome to stick around. I am going to write the code to check to see if a player has won or not won. But if you are at saturation point, go ahead and head out. Have an awesome day. I will see you tomorrow. And then we are off on Thursday for Rock on Tech. No hard feelings if you do want to head out, but I'm going to dive into the code checker now to see if someone has won. Okay. After we generate the board, I'm going to put in another function in here that says no, I'm going to do it down here. I'm going to say check for player win. And I'm going to just do the player wins for now. So how does it know how to check for the player win? Well, I have to write that in a function. So I'm going to say const check for player win is equal to this function. And what I want to do is I want to say, hey, go run through each one of the rows of the board and each one of the cols of the rows of the board. And I'm going to say, and I'm doing this on the fly here, so this may not work. This is engineering at work. So I'm going to say, let horizontal win, it's a bad name, let row win equal false. And I'm going to say, no, I'm going to set it to true. The reason I'm going to set it to true is I'm going to say, need the indexes here, row index of object entries board. And I'm checking to see if it runs across. So I'm going to get the col index and the col object.entries row. And I'm going to say, We're gonna do, let's take this a step back and do it the basic way. We can say if the row at 0, 0 equals X, and the row, I'm sorry, the board at 0, 1 equals X, and the board at 0, 2 equals X. Alert player 1. That's the most basic version of it, right? Is we're saying go check 0, 0, 0, 1, and 0, 2. And if all three of them are an X, then the player 1. We can do that again. We can say if 1, 0, 1, 1, and 1, 2, the player 1. And we can say if 2, 0, 2, 1, and 2, 2, the player also 1. So I can go across and I get player 1. I can then also invert them. I can say, and I'm going to leave notes in here, this is a row win, and this is a col win. So now I say 1, 1, 1. Am I doing that right? Col win is going to be if 0, 0, 0, 0. This is going to be 1, 0. And this is going to be 2, 0. And then we repeat, right? So we say this is 0, 1. This is 1, 1, and then this is 2, 1. And then and this is like, I talk to myself as I'm engineering this, right? And I'm like, okay, what are we checking for? This is 0, 2. So we're basically inverting them, right? And then we're going to say 1, 2, and then 2, 2. Player wins. So I come over and I go, all right, I'm going vertical. And now I get my player 1. And then the last one we would need to do is if board 0, 0 equals X, and board 1, 1 equals X, or and board 2, 2 equals X, then I get a diagonal win. Yeah. Make sure this is working first. Diagonal. Yep. And then we can go in reverse, right? We say 0, 2, 1, 1, and 2, 0. And player 1. And then we could also clear the board if we wanted to. So we could go on from there. The other thing that you could do is you could check to see if all the items in the array you were looking at were the same value. And if they were, then the player probably won, right? So there are ways of refactoring this down. So you're not doing explicit if statements. You're basically generating the potential. You're basically checking to see the way you think you would win, right? Instead of just saying, well, if this one and this one and this one, then you win, you could write it in that for loop to say, hey, go check this row. And if this row has all of the same 3 values, then that player won. So that is another way of thinking about it. And if it weren't 8:21 at night and I had code to reference, I could probably write that. But I don't think I can push myself to do that right now. You would basically say, and I'm going to do it anyway, aren't I? Let last value. Well, it's not 8:30. You guys got to get your money's worth. So if we're checking for the call wins, it's going to go across the whole thing. So let the last value you check. If there isn't a last value, we're on the first item that we're looking for. So set last value equal to whatever we're currently on. And else there is a last value. So check to see if this, if the last value is equal to the one that we're currently on. Actually check to see if it's not. If it's not, then go ahead and just continue on the loop. We haven't found a win. But if it is, then if it is, and the call index that we're on is 2, that means that we've made it to the last row and all 3 of them have been the same. So alert, player 1. No freaking way that works the first time. Sweet Jesus. Oh, that's because I have all of this up here. It's like, there's no way that would work. Last value, if there isn't a last value, we're on the first index. So take the current value and set it into the last value. Move on to the next value. If that last value has now been set, so we're going to go into the else statement. In the else statement, check to see if the last value, i.e. the first column, is not equal to this column. And if it isn't, that means that this is a winning column, so move on. Now, if it is equal to that, check to see if we're on the last column index, because if we are, then the player should win. Damn it, computer. Yeah, so that's not working. Console.log 1, console.log 2, console.log 3. So now we find out what's happening. We say 1, and it blocked me. Okay, so now when I click this button, it says logged out 1 twice. So it said there wasn't a last value twice. Which is weird. We could do that instead. We could say if the call index we're on is 0. Well, then that's weird. It never hit that. Let's just test something here. So 148. No, my board is fine. So loop over the board, get each one of the rows. For each one of the rows, loop over, get each one of the columns. And if the col index, let's just do this, console log, row index and col index. And it's going through 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 2. And we're checking to see if the col index is 0. And the first time, this isn't going to be a stupid, like, it's not a number, is it? Motherfucker. Great, that's it. Have a great night, everyone. We'll see ya. And I'm gonna get it a bunch. Okay. So let's see. It hit that on the 3. I wonder if did it hit the 2 twice. Index 0. Check the last value. If the last value does not equal this col, continue the loop. So it's hitting this twice, and then it's hitting 3 on the first run through. I wonder if that, no, it's highlighting the 4. It should be continuing the loop. And it hit that, ignore the first column, set in the last value. Next time this runs, col index is not 0. So go check if the last value, which is an X, is not equal to this value. Oh, you know what we need to do? We need to say row loop and continue the row loop. Because what's happening is we're saying if this column does not match the last value, move on to the next column. But I don't want it to move on to the next column. I want it to move on to the next row. Nope. Just spite me. Actually, I did need the output of that. So it hit 1. That's the first row. Then it hit 2, and it said, oh, you know what it's also doing? Let me try and put this back to if the col index is 2 and the last value is not empty. Because what it's doing is it's seeing 3 empties in a row, and it's like, yeah, you won. Mother. Seriously. Okay, so that means that should work for any row. That worked, and then this one should also work. It does. We won't mention that it's 8:30 and I did not make it work for columns, but in theory, you could also you could flip these for loops, and the for loops would theoretically check for all the columns in addition to checking for the rows. This is why I don't teach this during a normal class, because this is really complicated with if-else statements. But it does show you what you can achieve with a loop, and why sometimes it is just easier to go for the less complicated solution than it is to go for a loop. And that's all I got for you guys. Bring questions for tomorrow. I will stick around in case anyone has last-minute questions for tonight. Otherwise, have an awesome evening, and I will see you all tomorrow. Same time, same place. Yes. It will only check right now for a column win. It won't check, or it will only check for a row win. It won't check for a column win. So I'll put that back in. The other thing is we're not checking for a computer win either. So that's something to also think about. Checking for a computer win. This only checks for a maybe horizontal win of the player. Week 10, day 1 and day 2, and that is now in GitHub. All right, have an awesome night, everyone. See you guys tomorrow.